Great, thanks, Isa. And I'll stop sharing my camera just while I'm presenting the slides, so we can all concentrate on those. So a bit about me. So I'm based in the UK in Bradford-on-Avon. It's a lovely, quiet, sleepy kind of town near Bath. If people will have heard of Bath, more so than Bradford-on-Avon. And I'm what's known as a full stack software for geovation. It's not a term I particularly like, and it's actually not a term that many people like. I think even when I was recruited at Geovation, they would say we're not quite sure about this term, but it's commonly used to describe someone who basically knows a bit about everything. I think it has connotations of being a jack of all trades and master of none. Hopefully that's not the case. So it's very much the case that I really know kind of a bit about all aspects of software development life cycles. That's databases, front end, mobile applications, web applications, software applications, just through my kind of experience over the years. So it tends to get known as full stack software developer, and that's useful from a Geovation point of view, because obviously we support startups, we support the businesses who are using or members and part of our community. So it's really useful to be able to talk to people about whatever it is they're doing. So they might be asking for database advice, and we'll be able to talk about database schemas, or they want to know about mobile apps, and I'll be able to talk about that as well. So hopefully that's a good background in terms of being able to give a lot of support to the community. In terms of my own background, so I've got a background initially I started out in kind of financial services and CRM, which is customer relationship management. So that was creating the kind of software for banks that is kind of on display when you phone up your bank and they bring up your customer record, that kind of thing, which tells them you last called in 2 weeks ago and you discussed something, something completely different. I soon got a bit tired of the financial services sector, so I moved into local government and public sector, particularly libraries as well. So I worked for a number of years in public library software, which was really good, really rewarding, and I've still maintained a great love of libraries. And also being in public sector, there's a huge focus on geospatial and mapping. So everything that happens in, say, local government, but also central government happens somewhere, has a lot of focus on different communities, different map layers, things that have a location focus. So I really got into geospatial and have probably for the last 5 to 10 years specialized in geospatial software. I'm also really interested in open data and hackathons and all kinds of things, citizen science. So really encouraging citizens and people who are just engaged in their environment, in their local area, to get involved in data about their local community and kind of do things that make things better. So tech for good in general. And where Flutter comes in my last role for a frozen food supplier, I developed a online shopping app which kind of took consumer-based frozen food orders that hit not high levels of sales, but a 1 million sales target within a quite short space of time, which is really good. And we had a bit of a 1 minute sales party, which was a lot of fun. But that's my background in Flutter, which was a couple of years ago now, when Flutter was really new. We've had some questions about Flutter. I'm keen to kind of talk about Flutter, not in a deep dive way, but in a way that we want to talk about what Flutter is, how it compares to other tools on the market, why people might choose Flutter or why people might not choose Flutter. We're not kind of advocating for it in any particular way. It's just a relatively new tool that a lot of has really taken off and is worth people kind of understanding what it is and whether it could be useful to them. So going on to that a bit more, this is just a summary of what we'll cover today. So I'll talk a bit about an introduction to mobile development in general, its kind of history, what we mean by different options when we're doing mobile development. So that's cross-platform versus native, where I'll describe what they mean, competing technologies, and then I'll go into a bit more of the Flutter in-depth history and how it works. As I say, nothing too technical, so you don't need to be coming into this session with a vast technical understanding of what Flutter is or what programming languages Flutter uses, or really anything in terms of having to have a technical grasp of detail. This is really a session where we're looking at overviews and looking at at what Flutter is in terms of the kind of business need it might fulfill. We'll also talk about why you might choose particular mobile app development frameworks, and then obviously leave space for a Q&A. So really going back in time, really, I suppose we're at a stage now where 9 in 10 adults own a smartphone. I'm conscious these are UK figures, so we've got an international audience, which is fantastic. These will be similar figures, I imagine, but we're at the stage where the vast majority of adults own a smartphone, and that's fairly plateaued now. That was on a steep rise, I think, through the 2000s and 2010s, and is now largely stabilized in terms of that sort of 9 in 10 figure. We also saw that peak about, well, not peak as much, but 2012 was really where that kind of was taking off and rising above 50%. And also 2016 was where mobile web browsing overtook desktop. So that was a really significant moment for smartphones, because it meant that people were using smartphones more just for browsing websites, whatever that might be, whether it's media consumption, news. They were really using their smartphones for their primary browsing device. And what do you get out of mobile apps? So mobile apps offer you things like offline usage, device capabilities such as GPS, phone, and messages and camera. One interesting stat I saw when I was doing a bit of research for this presentation was that smartphones an individual smartphone is millions of times more powerful than the guidance computers used on the Apollo 11 mission. And obviously that's a considerable time ago, so that's not particularly surprising, but it does really kind of drill home that aspect of we've now got a computer in our pocket which is amazingly powerful and can do a huge amount, and is overtaking laptop usage and desktop usage in many ways. So moving on to mobile apps. So this is where I wanted to give an overview of different ways you can approach mobile app technology. So this is primarily for, let's say you're a startup or a new business and you want to develop a mobile app. The kind of initial questions you will have to ask yourself is, what do people mean by a native app? So when you develop a native app, what that means is you're using the preferred tools of that operating system to develop an app. So in the case of iOS, for example, that will be using Apple coding environments. It'll be using Apple programming languages, which are Swift and Objective-C. And it'll be creating an app that really fits in with the ecosystem of that operating system. So if you're creating an iOS app, it will have the components that Apple has designed for their app frameworks. And it will fit in pretty nicely with things like the settings tool on an iPhone and the email application, and give really sort of unified experience in terms of people being able to do swiping in the same way that they do it with their email system, and create a really good, rich, unified experience that makes the most of that particular device. The big downfall to that is that it's costly. So what it means you have to do is you create an app for an iOS user, but then you get to Android users and you have to go and create another app. You get to Windows users, as small as they may be these days, and you have to go and create another app. So what you're doing is you're doing development over and over again, which is obviously costly experience and hard, particularly for startups who are often looking to do, say, a minimum viable product to really get something out quite quickly, to demonstrate what they're about, what they want to do. And it's a really difficult thing to kind of embrace, creating the native app. So the answer to this is often to go cross-platform, and what this is it's using a framework which effectively means you can develop once and deploy to multiple platforms. So you would develop a single app and it would deploy automatically onto iOS devices and Android devices and any other platforms you want to target. Now, the difficulty of this is that it's using lots of different methods of achieving this. So sometimes it's, for example, using the native app technology of being able to display a web browser within an app. So it might allow you to develop web-based sort of HTML code and put that within the web browser that the app offers. So what you're really sort of having is a web experience that's wrapped up within a container, which is, say, deployed to iOS and then deployed to Android. It means you only have to develop once, but what it does mean, you sort of trade off in user experience. You're not getting that rich experience of the native controls and the native experiences that you'd expect from say, a dedicated iOS app or a dedicated Android app. And then it's worth also mentioning progressive web apps. So this is a relatively new, although it's been around for quite a few years, technology where you develop what is effectively a website, but you enable it for mobile use. And that allows you to do certain things. So when you might get a notification on your phone when you're using that website to add that website to your home screen. So it kind of creates a shortcut. It can start to do things like actually send push notifications. That's when you don't have the website open. It can actually send you a notification to your phone saying, go here to take up our offer of 10% off or whatever it might be. And so you're starting to get mobile-like capabilities within the web. And that's really powerful because you're then utilizing the fact that with web, you only develop for one platform. You have a really rich standards built application, which is using HTML5, using a really rich, accessible platform, but it does mean some feature limitations. So it's not broadly supported by iOS in many cases. So for some of the things you might be able to do for Android, you can't do for iOS. And you're still not getting the full feature-rich experience of, say, the dedicated native app. I'm just going to take a quick drink of water. And so if I think about some of these technologies and we look at them, you may have heard of a lot of these things. So native apps mean development in Swift, for Swift and Objective-C for iOS, Kotlin and Java for Android. And then cross-platform, you have a multitude of, this is by no means a comprehensive list, a multitude of different technologies that are cross-platform. So you have things like React Native, which is related to the React JavaScript platform, which is developed by Facebook. Xamarin, which was not originally developed by Microsoft, but is now owned by Microsoft. You have Ionic, you have Flutter, which we'll also be covering a bit today, and many more other frameworks which are designed to deliver this cross-platform capability. You then also have many web app frameworks within developing a kind of web application that can be deployed onto a mobile device, as say React.js and various other platforms which are effectively the same platforms as you get when you're doing web development, but are offering you the ability to kind of quickly develop web experiences and web applications which give you feature-rich components very quickly. And so I wanted to cover a bit about what you would do when choosing a technology. And taking a bit of a step back from technology is thinking about people first. So particularly with startups, small businesses, quite often you're constrained, or it's not really a constraint, it's a benefit in many senses. You're benefiting from having people in your company or people you know, and what are the skills and expertise that they offer. So that's really your first thought in terms of choosing technology. It's not, I must develop an app in Flutter because that's a new thing, or I must, I really desperately want a native app experience, so I have to go and develop an iOS app and an Android app. What you should really be thinking of is who do I have available and what is their preferred technology? What are they experienced in? What are they comfortable in? And that will primarily probably dictate what you do first. It might not dictate what you do further down the line, but it will dictate what you can initially achieve. And as I say, that's a really good thing to be focused on. It's really good to focus first on people and not on technology. So think about who you have available and what they can do. But going beyond that, you might also be thinking about pace. So this is really pace of development. Do you need to get something out in 2 months, 1 month, in 6 months? Do you have a fair amount of time? That will dictate what kind of technologies you can choose. So if you're thinking about longer term, you can choose technologies which may be unfamiliar, so people have a bit of time to get experience of them. You can also choose the option which might mean more development. So maybe you can develop 2 apps, an iOS version and an Android version, if you have 6 months. You probably can't do that if you have 1 or 2 months. What you should also be thinking of is future development and maintenance. So can you maintain, and maintenance means new features as well as supporting old features. So can you maintain multiple apps at once? If you have a bug that appears in one app and not the other, that's obviously an overhead, because that's just one bug. You might have 2 bugs which appear on different apps. You're effectively maintaining the code base for multiple apps, and that's harder to do. Also, will you struggle to find enough developers who know all the languages that you might have adopted? You might want to think about maintenance in terms of what is the most popular languages that developers know. So how easy is it for me to find someone who knows Flutter? How easy is it for me to find someone who knows Xamarin or whatever technology you've chosen? And then there's a more difficult one, which is longevity. So when you're choosing a technology, you can never quite know, but a technology can suddenly die. Within 1 or 2 years, it can go from flavor of the month to no one uses this anymore. It's out of date. It's gone, and something else has taken its place. You have to kind of do a bit of investigation to see where that is. Where is the current trajectory in terms of trends? Who is on the up? But then you also have to start thinking about, well, you don't want something too new because it's not necessarily proven. It's not necessarily got the developer base using it. But again, not too old, unless it's really established and is still popular. If you're seeing something which is declining in use, then maybe you have to assume it's going to continue to decline in use. And in that sense, check GitHub, check Stack Exchange, check Statista, which is a place that has sort of statistics on these kind of surveys of what developers are using. Check all those sources to make sure you understand what technologies you can adopt and know a bit about kind of where they're going. So sorry for that kind of quite long-winded introduction to where Flutter fits in within mobile app development.
Sorry, Dave, can I just quickly interrupt you? Can I just kindly ask you, just in case it will block some of the information on your slides, because we can see your calendar reminder for the Flutter webinar in Tenzing in the room. It's cool. I just thought in case there is, so if you can just X that or dismiss that, we find it fabulous. Just in case there'll be content that will then be blocked by the reminder. Thank you.
Hopefully not, but yeah, that's a good shout. Yeah, so the history of Flutter, and we're talking about a relatively new technology here. So I've only got 3 dates here, and it really is from start to current day. So the first version of Flutter was known as Sky. I don't know why. It just was. It was an early name, and that was unveiled at the 2015 Dart Summit by Google. So this is really something that Google announced in 2015, but that was very much early days. It was really in December 2018 that Flutter, the first version, was released at an event, again run by Google. So Google maintain Flutter. It's an open source project, but they maintain it and develop it. So if you think December 2018, that was really not very long ago, and this was relatively close also to pandemic. So the timescales here are difficult to judge in terms of whether that's a long time or kind of short time in terms of sort of the dev world. But it's still effectively only 3.5 years in terms of the age of this technology. The current stable version is on version 3, and it uses a Dart version of 2. So Dart is really just the programming language and the framework that is also Google owned and maintained. And that's just a programming language, a bit like things like Swift and Objective-C and C++, whereas the technology overall is called Flutter. So you have about regular yearly releases now of Flutter. We're at a fairly stable version, which I'll talk about. Kind of it's deployed to multiple platforms, is now getting established, but we're still talking about a relatively recent technology.
Sorry. Oh yes, perfect. Thanks.
And in that context, I wanted to also talk about the rise of Flutter. So in that short time, we've got 3.5 years, it has really overtaken pretty much most other mobile app frameworks in terms of the cross-platform app frameworks in a very short space of time. So it was in 2021, which again is only, we're talking two to 3 years since it was launched. It became the most popular cross-platform mobile framework used by developers. So, at that point in time, more developers were currently using Flutter than any other cross-platform mobile framework. And it has a vast community of developers talking about Flutter. So this graph that I have on the right is from Stack Overflow. So it's looking at the number of questions in a particular month from 2009 to sort of 2022. And showing what percentage of them are certain technologies. And we're seeing React Native, which was launched around 2015 and has gone up fairly steadily to about 1.4% of questions on Stack Overflow. Flutter, on the other hand, you can see the launch at 2018, and it rapidly expanded to being almost 3% of all questions on Stack Overflow. So that's a huge number of developers talking about Flutter, and that's not necessarily, it's difficult to gauge this kind of thing. We're literally looking at kind of chatter stats, and it's really hard to kind of say that's a proof that Flutter is better than anything else. What it is proof of is that a lot of people are talking about it and asking developer questions about it, which probably means they're using it at the same time. So unless it's sort of particularly unreliable and lots of people have to ask questions to kind of understand it, it's a good indication that it's on the rise in terms of usage. Now, this is probably the most technical aspect of the presentation, and hopefully it's not too technical, but I did want to cover a bit about how Flutter actually works. So there's really these three kind of layers to Flutter. So at the very bottom layer, you have the embedder. This is, to some extent, no developer or project manager or anyone involved in the company has to worry too much about this layer, but it's what makes Flutter work on different platforms. So whether that platform is the web, whether it's Windows or Android or iOS, it has code effectively that is making it work on that platform. Then this middle layer, you have the Flutter engine. Now this is the actual graphics library, which is creating the Flutter app itself and drawing its UI. Flutter uses what's known as a 2D graphics library to actually draw. You can almost think of Flutter as being a game environment. So it's a bit like kind of being within a let's say you're playing a software game. It's drawing the screen as you're kind of as you're using the app, and so it's not necessarily using existing components that exist in, say, iOS or Android or on the web. It's not using HTML. It's drawing its own screen that is displaying the contents of the app, and that's all done the same way between whatever environment you're using. That's running on the embedder, and it's drawing the app screens. And at the top, you have the actual Flutter framework, the Dart framework, and that's the sort of nuts and bolts that people have to actually worry about. So that's where you're actually getting into Dart code and using components that Flutter offer to you, and developing in Flutter. So beyond all that, you kind of don't have to worry about the Flutter engine or the embedder. What you only have to worry about is the Dart framework and developing the Flutter app in terms of using Dart code. And what that means in terms of what the user sees is they see a unified experience between any platform. So if you're on iOS or Android, you have a pretty near identical app in terms of how it looks, how it performs, the kind of the refresh rate, the kind of the graphics of the app. It looks exactly the same no matter what platform you're running it on. Now, if I talk about the positives, so there's a lot of positives to Flutter, and I've got a couple of years, which in the life of Flutter is probably almost half of its lifetime. A couple of years of experience of using Flutter, and I can personally say it's an enjoyable development experience. it has this concept of everything being a widget, and they almost kind of use it as a mantra. So whether or not you're building a menu item or a bottom bar that kind of comes up from the bottom of the screen, or you're building a kind of more detailed screen or menu bar, everything is kind of a widget that kind of has a hierarchy and is quite a good and enjoyable but also intuitive experience in terms of learning that technology. And I suspect this has actually helped it, particularly with the developer community, which has particularly helped that kind of rise in terms of people using Flutter and getting excited about Flutter. It's got a enthusiastic fan base. It's also write once and deploy absolutely everywhere. So I kind of highlight absolutely because this isn't actually just a mobile framework. When we're talking about Flutter, we are deploying to Windows, we're deploying to Linux, we're deploying to the web. So you can actually have a Flutter app which runs on a desktop computer, on a Linux laptop, on in a web browser for people to use on the web. You can pretty much run it anywhere. And that's really powerful in terms of being able to target a lot of different customers and a lot of different customer needs. Some customers might have Linux desktop computers that they want to have an app for, and that they won't consider using the web or having network computers or using a mobile device. So you can deploy to them very easily. It's also growing, as we've kind of seen. It's very popular, and it's open source and well maintained, so you don't have any licensing implications in terms of cost and the maintenance. Although at the moment it's fairly dependent on Google for maintenance, it does have a huge developer fan base. So I suspect even if it was dropped by Google, it would have a huge army of developers in terms of being able to kind of maintain it and provide further developments. But then we do have some negatives. So the fact that it deploys everywhere, but not necessarily the best way of deploying anywhere. So this is a slightly contrary statement, but it's saying that where we had that slide previously where I was talking about the negatives of cross-platform, you're really not getting the perfect platform experience in any of those situations. So let's say you're developing a Linux app, or you're developing a Windows app, or you're developing a web app. You're not getting the perfect experience within those platforms because you are giving this trade-off of developing one single app which deploys anywhere. And if you're happy with that, that's a perfectly reasonable trade-off to make. But it does mean that you don't necessarily have the power of, say, something which may only be available within a Linux app, or something that may only be available on a Windows app. You can't really make use of, or it's more of a struggle to make use of, because you've gone down this single app route. You also have, pardon me again, we go back. You also have a slight overhead, so it's a slightly larger app because we have that situation where you have these 3 layers. You have, for every app that you deploy, you have those first, bottom and middle layer where the app has to hold those layers as part of the single app that's deploying onto the device. It means it gives you a bit of an overhead. That's an overhead in terms of size. So if you're downloading the app, there's going to be a bit of an overhead in terms of size for each app you deploy. There's also going to be a bit of a performance overhead. So there's a bit of performance going towards actually running that Flutter engine and running that embedder within each app. There's also fairly significant examples of poor user experience in some situations. So Flutter for the web, for example, doesn't use HTML. What that means is it loses quite a bit in terms of HTML standards and accessibility. For people who kind of know web development, what Flutter does, it deploys into a mix of canvas components and other ways of displaying that isn't just using plain HTML controls. So it means you don't necessarily have things like the standard text input experience that you would get through a HTML app. But it has lots of apps. So if you're using a mobile device at the moment and you have certain apps, you might well have, say, a vast amount of Google apps. If you're a Google user, Assistant, Google Home, Google Ads, Google Pay are all Flutter apps. Also, other big apps, eBay, BMW, Sonos, are all written in Flutter. So the chances are is you have an app currently on your phone which is Flutter based. And then I think the last thing I wanted to cover was a bit about mapping, because obviously we are Geovation, and one of the questions we might get asked is, can Flutter do maps? And the answer is very much yes, with a bit of a caveat. So Flutter is really good at doing Google Maps for pretty obvious reasons, because it's developed by Google. They make it very easy to embed Google mapping platforms. But what we have done actually recently is we're creating an example mapping application which uses Flutter as well as interchangeably either the Map Libre or Mapbox Foundation plugins. And what it does is it has an ecosystem that which enables third-party applications to be embedded into Flutter. So what you wrap the existing native plugin. So Mapbox, for example, has an iOS and an Android plugin, which have been wrapped effectively by the developer community into Flutter versions. One limitation of that is that it means that is only available then on Android and iOS. So because there's not the underlying native, say, Linux app for Mapbox or Windows, for example, you can't then deploy to those platforms because there's simply no underlying code to say run Mapbox within a Linux desktop environment. But you can, deploy to your mobile platforms and use Mapbox if you want to. And I think we've got to the end, so that's time for questions and thank you. I am available on LinkedIn. Obviously, to the existing Geovation community, you can always drop me a message on Slack. We run tech clinics, so you can always contact me to have a chat about Flutter, to have a chat about any of the things I've talked about today, and more between. But we're going to open it up now to, I think, questions, Isa.
Yes, we are indeed. Thank you so much, Dave, for that introduction and so much information. I know that always you have to wrap your head around some of these things at first a little bit, but we've already got some questions, so I'll start firing away. But please please feel free to put more questions into the questions section, and we'll try and get through as many as we possibly can. So we'll start with some easy introductory ones, hopefully, and then work our way through so as we go. So please if something pops into your head, please just put it in the question section. We'll get around to it. Also, of course, we appreciate that you might have to reflect and digest all the content that you've learned today, and you might have questions later on, tomorrow, in a week's or a month's time. As Dave there mentioned, obviously you can reach us on Slack directly if you are a Geovation member, and I have shared the link with you in terms of how you can get or how you can become a Geovation member as well. So please feel free. It's free of charge. There's not you can join our community without having to pay anything. So of course there's lots of great benefits there, and Dave and the tech team, they run tech clinics as well on a weekly and regular basis, so you'd be able to tap into those as well as a member. So for those details, make sure you sign up as a member if you're not yet. And as I said, I will share these slides and the presentation video and the recording as well with you after the session, so you'll be able to watch it back again, reflect upon it and have a think. So if you've got questions coming up at any point afterwards, feel free to email us at events@geovation.uk or reach out to us on Slack directly. But I'll get started there then, Dave. So what are the best places to learn more about Flutter? Just to sort of reiterate where there might be more resources to sort of tap into.
Yeah, so I mentioned, in terms of researching Flutter, there's all those kind of resources in terms of GitHub and Stack Overflow and Statista. If you're looking to kind of get an overview of where Flutter sits within the ecosystem of different tools. But in terms of Flutter itself, because it's so new, I think you're kind of looking at a bit differently to say maybe traditional ways of learning. I've noticed recently a lot of people are taking to YouTube in terms of doing, say, tutorials and blog posts and things like that. So, video blogging is now a bigger thing, I think, with developers than, say, it used to be, which is, you know, people have different ways of learning, and that's actually really good. So sometimes watch people do coding, for example, whereas I was always quite happy watching it, reading a blog, for example, you know, and seeing little code snippets. I'm finding a lot more people doing YouTube videos or kind of, yeah, watching them code and things like that. So I would check out YouTube actually for Flutter. Obviously, the kind of normal places of going, like you know, blogs and searching Google. But yeah, YouTube is a really good resource for actually finding out about Flutter and doing all those kind of how-tos and hello world startup and all that kind of stuff is really, yeah, go to YouTube.
Amazing. Yeah, I feel like everything is on YouTube now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or TikTok for some reason. I think everyone seems to use that
Well,
platform.
probably. I'm not in date with social media, but I'm sure TikTok is probably where Flutter is taking off as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember reading they've done a study and they have identified that the average attention span is 8 seconds now. So I think we're fighting against some of that, and you know, never mind. Yeah, so in terms of for startups specifically, to what extent would you recommend using Flutter if you're a startup? Is there sort of, you know, I know you've touched on obviously the benefits, the pros, the positives, the negatives, but I guess is it very recommendable for startups specifically?
So I think it is, but probably aside from those positive and negatives, I'll be looking again at that sort of earlier bit I talked about in terms of who do you have available and you know, what are kind of, I mean, what can your people do in terms of experience and what are they comfortable with, really taking that people first approach to you know, minimum viable product and being able to get something out and being able to do something you're comfortable and happy using, you know, is really important, especially when you're starting up, because it's a daunting time and you don't want to be using a new technology that you're not happy with or you're not familiar with, at least. So I'd recommend Flutter if you're learning about a technology. If you're looking to start up and you maybe don't know any technologies, I'd certainly recommend Flutter. Otherwise, I'd sort of say, you know, always take what you know as being kind of the most important thing and what you're most comfortable with. But certainly, if you want to, you know, delve into something you don't know anything, you don't have an alternative, go for Flutter and you know, enjoy it, you know, make and kind of enjoy that community and being part of that kind of sort of real high-flying new software. It does kind of inspire quite a lot of excitement around the developer community.
Amazing, great. And how expensive is it to find a developer that specializes in Flutter? I guess obviously startups, as you've mentioned, you know, resource finance, everything is rather limiting or certainly still in the developing phase. So you know, what sort of costs do you reckon are we looking at?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because, like you say, so because again Flutter is very new, you're looking at a different situation, say employing a web developer or employing someone who uses C++, which is maybe a programming language that goes back, you know, 20, 30 years or whatever. So you're going to get a different type of person to some extent. So you're less likely, for example, to get agency people who maybe offer Flutter as part of their package because it's relatively new. They haven't kind of got to that level where they maybe have a list of Flutter developers. What you're likely to get is people on maybe the kind of more gig economy type freelance type platforms where they can, you know, you can kind of like find a developer who knows Flutter. To some extent, you can find quite a lot of contractors, I think, currently on Flutter, but they tend to be people who are less experienced in contracting. So maybe they've been contracting for within the last, you know, started within the last 5 years or so, rather than the kind of contractors you might get for a technology which is 10 to 20 years old. So I appreciate the question was about expense. The expense is probably cheaper to some extent, but you're getting people who are probably less experienced in the field. That's very much a generalization though, but yeah, that's the sort of general thing you might be looking at.
Okay. I guess it's hard. It's because you either take the expert who happens to also look into Flutter or who happens to sort of add that to their development skills, or you get someone who doesn't have any of the other skills because all they do is focus on Flutter, for example, or similar platforms that way. So,
yeah, and you get a lot of people who are starting out.
To have.
Yeah, you get a lot of people who will be starting out with Flutter. And for startups particularly, that's probably a lot of the people they're looking for. They're looking for people who are kind of coming on a journey with them. But again, it's a generalization. Sometimes you'll get people who are bringing experience to the startup and all sorts of different situations. But yeah, there'll be plenty of interesting people who are using Flutter.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a few more questions that have come in, so please keep them coming. We still have a bit of time, so yeah, don't be shy to raise any questions that you might have. There's no such thing as a wrong or weird or wonderful question, so there we go. Is it possible to use third-party SDKs with Flutter? Oops, apologies.
Yeah, and because this wasn't I appreciate because this wasn't sort of a deep dive into Flutter, I didn't go too much into the sort of the inner workings of Flutter. What normally happens is that you get an SDK which is maybe targeted at the native environment. So I sort of mentioned with Mapbox and with MapLibre, you might, for example, get the iOS SDK. There's a bit of an overhead then in terms of what you have to do is wrap it in the Flutter Dart code, and then you can use it within your Flutter app. So you'd have to say wrap the iOS SDK and then wrap the Android SDK, and then you'd have some code within your Flutter app which sort of says, if I'm on iOS, go and use the iOS SDK. If I'm on Android, go and use the Android one. It's a slightly long-winded process, but actually what you do have a lot of times, if that's a really popular SDK, someone's done it for you. So what you actually have is a community out there who's gone and done that, and they've packaged it up into an easy to use overall wrapper which you can plug into your app really, really quickly. So what you'll find is that you can do it really quickly as long as you either do it yourself or someone else has done it for you.
We love it when someone else does it for us.
It's always the best thing. And you can search. So Flutter has what's known as a bit like in JavaScript frameworks have a kind of online kind of repositories of all the plugins. Flutter has its own example, and you can quickly search there and you'll find whatever it is you're looking for majority of times.
Great. Again, if there's any follow-up questions from some of your questions that, if we haven't quite answered it the way that you were hoping, or if there's any sort of follow-on from the response, then feel free again to fire that into the question section. So what's the level of control or access to smartphone sensors? So for example, GPS, the accelerometer, things like that.
So again, I mean, it's actually unintentionally, it's a very similar question to the last one. So those kind of access is often gained via SDKs, so via kind of the native way of doing things. So quite often, again, what you would do is you will search the Flutter plugin store for accelerometer access, for example, and you'll find a plugin which is ideally used by millions of developers. You find the most popular one and grab it, and it will do everything you need to do. And that will pretty much be the case for any of the major device capabilities. So yeah, it's really a case of using those plugins which will give you instant cross-platform access to those device capabilities. As I said, the kind of caveat is that you lose the option of deploying to all the different environments. So you can deploy to Android, iOS, Windows desktop, Linux desktop. If your typical Linux desktop doesn't have an accelerometer, you do have to be a bit cautious because you're sort of then deploying onto an environment which probably won't have the device capability that you need. But as I say, if you're just targeting, say, mobile, you can do it fairly easily.
I know you've touched on that, but just maybe as a reiteration, so what or who helps maintain the Flutter project or the ecosystem as a whole? I know that we've touched on that in ways, but I guess
it's
a recap.
Primarily Google. So I haven't looked recently at Google. So I think it's Google alone pretty much, rather than being, say, a team of anyone anyone who can. There is an option to get involved because I had a very passionate colleague who is part of that Flutter ecosystem, and I think he was quite involved with that open source movement. But I'm not sure about the current contribution kind of framework that they have out for that project. So what I would do is go on GitHub, look at Flutter, and then have a look at the what it tends to be called is the policy for contributing, contributor policy they call it. So have a look at that policy, and it will likely lay out the terms for getting involved in that ecosystem.
Fabulous, that sounds good. And are there any libraries for Apple CarPlay or Android Auto to display maps in the infotainment of the vehicles? I love the infotainment.
Both those things, I believe. So Apple, so CarPlay and Android Auto. Yeah, I looked at this actually for one of our Scottish startups actually relatively recently, and it is, yes, that there are. So you can start to target the infotainment system within your car and develop in that way. So I haven't done it personally, but yes, you can go down that route.
Okay, and there's one more question that's come in, but again, if you have any more, now's your chance. Final call for any further questions. Please fire them our way. As I said earlier, of course, we appreciate that you might have questions sort of popping into your head as you sort of further think about what you've been told today, what you've learned, or as you start implementing and playing around with the platform itself as well. Please do reach out to us, and also do come for one of the clinics that Dave is running. So obviously that's your chance as well then to dive deep into your personal projects that you might be looking into with Flutter. You mentioned including maps in a Flutter app. And this particular person is mentioning that a friend has developed sort of on features with the OpenStreetMap, but are OS maps available? And if so, is there a cost? The app is for a charity. So I guess it's how there's ways in which we can connect this.
Yeah, so it's slightly so OS Maps isn't available. It's not available sort of via direct means, but the fact that you can embed, say, a Mapbox map means that you have a standard mapping technology that you can then link to the OS Maps APIs and vector tiles and other services, which will give you then rich actual base maps and features within your map. So effectively, yes, you can embed all of OS's rich data into a Flutter map. You can even do that via the Google route. If say you had a Google map on your Flutter map, you can kind of pull in OS data. There is a cost in terms of the OS premium data, but there is also OS open data. So OS has what's known as Open Zoom Stack, which is a base map of vector tiles, which you can take and host yourself to actually provide the base mapping layer, which will give you a lovely kind of a number of options in terms of sort of a grayscale option, a nice streets option, and an explorer type option, which is completely free open source technology for base mapping. So there's a few different options you can do in terms of embedding maps and using OS data, either through the free route or through the premium data route.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dave. As I said, there has not been any more questions just now, but please email us if you have any questions. And of course, as well, I have shared with you, hopefully you've all received that in the chat, a link to a feedback survey. It only takes sort of 3, maybe 4 minutes, depending on how closely you read the questions. But just make sure that you give us your feedback. We always love to know how we did, how you found the session, what you found particularly useful. And what's really, really useful, especially to myself as the events manager, is understanding what other sessions, what other content you might like to see from us. I'm always aiming to run the program very much focused on the community and making sure that your needs are met with these, so that I can bring in learning and sort of development opportunities for you as a community that best suits you. So if I know of your blockages or any of your sort of desired learnings, then that obviously helps me in making sure I connect you with the right experts that can deliver on that kind of content. So this is particularly useful if you take the 3 minutes or so to complete the survey. That would be hugely appreciated. And of course, that means I can put events on that are most relevant to you. As I said, you'll get another email, another email follow-up from me with the link to the recording, with the, that's obviously including the slides there and the direct details for the contact as well. I'll make sure I'll include the survey link as well. If you do it now, that would be amazing. And yeah, and then also send you a link to our events page as well, so you can see what other fabulous events we have coming up, because there's quite a lot of them listed. So yeah, thank you so much, Dave. It's been a pleasure to have you. you. Thank you so much for giving us all of this content and all of your know-how. Really, really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you everyone for coming and joining today. I know, as I said, it's a really wonderful and beautiful summery day, so it's even more so appreciated that you've taken the afternoon to come and listen to a Geovation webinar. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, have a wonderful rest of the week. Don't melt away. Make sure you have ice creams at the ready. And at least everyone in the UK who's facing the heat wave, I don't know what the weather is at Ohio at the moment, but I imagine it's quite hot as well. Yeah, have a wonderful rest of the week. Take good care and see you at a future event. Thank you. Bye.